Alright folks, tonight we're kicking off with something you won't find in your typical war documentaries or dusty high school history textbooks. We're talking about chow. Specifically, the kind that kept millions of soldiers barely alive in the trenches during World War I. Drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Always blows my mind seeing our global audience tuning in. Now, dim those lights, maybe crank up a fan for some white noise, and let's take this journey together. When it came to trench cuisine, the British Army wasn't aiming for Michelin stars, just basic survival with a side of crushing disappointment. Their standard rations read like the opening lines of a Dickensian tragedy: canned mystery meat, rock-hard biscuits, and endless mugs of tea that tasted like dirt. Let's start with the infamous bully beef. This was corned beef swimming in gelatinous fat, packed into tins that required either a bayonet, a lucky rock, or divine intervention to open. The texture? Like chewing on regret. The flavor? Like something that might have been meat in a past life. Soldiers ate it cold, smeared it on crackers, or fried it up, assuming they could get a fire going between artillery barges. Then we've got the hardtack biscuits, affectionately nicknamed tooth breakers or dog biscuits. These dense, dry crackers could survive water damage, time itself, and probably small arms fire. Most soldiers soaked them in tea or soup just to make them edible. Some swore these biscuits were leftovers from the Boer War, just repackaged. That's not a joke, that's military logistics for you. Now, the one redeeming feature? Tea. Strong, sweet, and black enough to stand a spoon upright. This was the British soldier's comfort in a tin cup, served around the clock, before charges, during gas attacks, after burying friends. One officer claimed tea saved more British lives than bulletproof vests ever could. But quality was a crapshoot. Frontline troops often went days without fresh supplies. When food did arrive, it might be waterlogged, moldy, or already claimed by rats with better survival instincts. Some men improvised trench pudding from scraps of bully beef, biscuit crumbs, and sheer desperation. The Brits also issued something called McConaughey stew, a canned horror show of turnips, potatoes, and fat that smelled like death's front porch. Eaten cold, it tasted like grief. Heated up, slightly less like grief. If British trench food was an endurance test, the French approach was a daily middle finger to adversity. Even knee-deep in mud with death whistling overhead, French soldiers, or poilus, insisted on keeping mealtime civilized. Their foundation? Bread, lots of it. Crusty, pained ammunition, loaves baked in massive batches and hauled to the front by mule. Was it always fresh? Hell no. But even stale, it beat British hardtack in both flavor and dental safety. Alongside the bread came cheese, occasional tinned meat, and when luck smiled, sardines or beans. But the real morale booster? Wine. Yes, despite the nightmare of trench warfare, French soldiers got their daily wine ration, about half a liter per man. This wasn't fine Bordeaux, more like sour, weak plunk you'd drink fast before the bottle remembered it wasn't vinegar. But it kept spirits up and reminded men they were still human, or at least still French. Some soldiers got creative with makeshift stoves built from salvaged debris, boiling water in helmets, and stirring soups with bayonets. One sergeant famously cooked omelets in spent shell casings. Nobody asked where the eggs came from. Nobody wanted to know. The wine, Pinard, became so culturally essential that commanders worried more about wine shortages than ammunition. Soldiers joked they could handle machine guns, but not dry canteens. Supplies were inconsistent. Food often arrived spoiled or full of shrapnel. But the French spirit was clear. If you're going to suffer, do it with bread in one hand and wine in the other. Early in the war, German soldiers ate surprisingly well. Hearty rations organized with Teutonic efficiency. Dark rye bread, sausages, smoked meats, potatoes, sauerkraut, and strong black coffee. For a brief moment, it almost felt like a rustic picnic, if you ignored the rats, mud, and screaming shells overhead. But as the war dragged on and Allied blockades tightened, German rations underwent a depressing transformation. Welcome to the era of ersatz, a word meaning replacement, but really meaning not quite food. Ersatz coffee, made from roasted barley or acorns, smelled vaguely like coffee but tasted like punishment. Ersatz flour contained sawdust and potato starch. Ersatz meat came in cans labeled with question marks. Through it all, the indestructible black bread remained, dense, sour, and capable of surviving trench humidity. You could eat it, use it as a sandbag, or knock out rats with it. Some swore it had shrapnel-resistant properties, and they weren't wrong. As conditions worsened, meat became mythical. Cabbage, turnips, and mystery soups took center stage. Fat became currency. Soldiers would trade cigarettes, boots, even ammo for a smear of bacon grease to make turnip soup slightly less soul-crushing. Yet German soldiers stayed resourceful. Field kitchens kept operating. Some dug makeshift ovens. Others bartered with locals. Desperation bred creativity. Some trench stews were both horrifying and oddly effective. But nothing symbolized their decline like the transition from real sausage to ersatz sausage, a culinary fall from grace that haunted stomachs across the Western Front. By 1918, many German troops were running on empty. Hunger wasn't just discomfort, it became strategic collapse. The soldiers felt it, and so did the war effort. Feeding the Austro-Hungarian army was like herding cats through a minefield. This multi-ethnic empire with a dozen languages and crumbling supply chains turned military logistics into organized chaos. Standard rations included black bread, often moldy, and soup, the universal answer to what's left in the wagon. This Eintopf, one pot, might contain beans, barley, ancient potatoes, or mystery bones. It was the army's entire food strategy in a single depressing bowl. Hungarian troops craved paprika-heavy stews. Czechs missed dumplings. Slovenians just wanted something that wasn't gray. Cooks did their best with what little they had. Lard featured heavily, smeared on bread, used in soups, sometimes eaten straight when things got desperate. Not delicious, but calories beat presentation in trench warfare. Logistics were a nightmare. Supplies arrived late, got lost, or were liberated by someone else. Some troops went days without proper meals, leading to foraging, looting, or repurposing cavalry horses into stew without asking the horse's opinion. Some regional units managed local dishes when possible, using ingredients from the countryside. But most soldiers just endured the culinary roulette of Central Command. And let's not forget the coffee, usually roasted grain or beet pulp pretending to be caffeine. Soldiers drank it anyway. It was hot, bitter, and slightly less depressing than cold water. In the end, Austro-Hungarian trench food wasn't unified, but the misery was shared. And in that suffering, there was a strange camaraderie. After all, if you can survive boiled turnip stew and shell fire in the same afternoon, you're bonded for life. If trench food across Europe was bleak, Russian rations somehow made everyone else look overfed. The Russian soldiers' diet during World War I was an exercise in austere suffering, fortified by orthodox faith and rock-bottom expectations. The staple? Black bread, dense, sour, and usually frozen solid in winter. Soldiers hacked it apart with bayonets or smashed it against rocks. If you could chew it without cracking a molar, congratulations, you were halfway to a meal. Next came salo, thick slabs of cured pig fat, served cold. No seasoning, no ceremony, just pure animal fat. Russians didn't nibble it. They bit chunks like nature's energy bars. Nutritious? Absolutely. Appetizing. Only if you'd been shell-shocked into not caring. Kasha, buckwheat porridge, appeared when available. Hearty, filling, and mercifully warm. One of the few edible items, though often served unseasoned in portions best described as symbolic. Then there was shkai, cabbage soup, thin, watery, and cabbage-heavy. Rumored to lower morale 12% per spoonful. Occasionally a mystery bone or unidentifiable lump would surface, greeted with cheers and deep suspicion. Meat, rare and philosophical. When it appeared, it was either ancient, gray, or possibly equine. Nobody asked. The line between hunger and dignity was thin, and most soldiers crossed it daily. Russian supply lines, already stretched across a massive empire, were spectacularly dysfunctional. Soldiers often received rations late, if at all. During offensives, they resorted to looting villages, boiling tree bark, or chewing on their own despair. Then there was vodka, the unofficial Russian ration. When available, it functioned as painkiller, morale booster, and, if consumed quickly enough, soup substitute. Unfortunately, it was often watered down or replaced with liquid that smelled like furniture polish. In the end, Russian trench food wasn't about what you ate, but what you survived. If it had calories and didn't fight back, you were grateful. And if it arrived warm, that was either a miracle or a trap. When the Americans finally arrived in 1917, they came with fresh optimism, shiny gear, and unshakable belief their rations were superior. Technically true, if you judged meals by calorie count rather than emotional trauma. The cornerstone? The reserve ration, a lovingly packed death row of canned meat, hardtack, coffee, sugar, salt, and because this is America, 3 cigarettes per meal. Yes, the U.S. Army issued smokes as part of dinner. Lung health could wait. Flavor was clearly beyond hope. Let's start with the meat. Corned beef hash packed into cans with consistency best described as fork-resistant. Cold, it resembled carpet padding. Hot, it resembled steaming carpet padding. Soldiers nicknamed it goldfish, not because it swam, but because it came in tins and made them nostalgic for home-cooked meals that didn't taste like regret. Then came the bacon, theoretically a morale booster until you opened the package. Grayish, fatty, and salty enough to preserve a horse. Eaten raw, chewy, fried, vaguely edible, especially if you hadn't eaten since Belgium. Beans were the real American trench classic, canned, baked, floating in mystery sauce. Troops quickly learned nothing bonds men like communal bean digestion in a shared dugout. But what the Yanks truly worshipped was coffee, brewed strong enough to strip paint, poured from kettles that hadn't been cleaned since Fort Leavenworth. This was trench holy water, black, bitter, and hotter than your rifle barrel. And that was on a good day. Let's not forget chewing gum. Thoughtfully issued to combat stress, rot teeth more slowly, and maybe stop you from chewing your own fingers during shelling. To be fair, American rations were reliable, which made them exotic by European standards. Sure, they lacked flavor, but they arrived on time, didn't bite back, and rarely contained live worms. That said, after 5 days of beans and hash, even the Germans started looking less threatening than another breakfast of mystery meat. Feeding the Ottoman army across deserts, mountains, and collapsing infrastructure was like playing culinary Jenga during an earthquake. The average Ottoman soldier, often Turkish, Arab, or Kurdish, received rations calibrated to induce culinary despair. The staple? Lentils, boiled into mush, fried into patties, or stared at in silence. Not by choice, by inevitability. Onions were next, raw, pickled, or roasted if you found fire. Nutritionally honest, but emotionally devastating. Then there was flatbread, decent when fresh, which in trenches, it never was. Once hardened, it doubled as armor plating or emergency footwear. Meat? Don't be greedy. When it appeared, it was usually salted lamb or goat, chewy, greasy, and old enough to remember the Crimean War. Most soldiers saw meat only in dreams. Instead, they made do with bulgur, rice, or whatever didn't fight back in the supply sack. Ottoman supply chains, never speedy, frequently collapsed. Food arrived soaked, spoiled, or stolen. There was no winning. To their credit, many Ottoman soldiers were decent field cooks, turning rations into edible fare using dented pots, human, and sheer willpower. But let's be clear, this was survival, not cuisine. The real tragedy? No proper coffee. Once an empire staple, good Turkish coffee became a war casualty. The replacement? Bitter roasted chickpea or acorn brew that inspired exactly zero poetry. Canadian soldiers inherited the British ration system, meaning they too were blessed with bully beef, hardtack, and tea. But while the food was identical, the attitude was distinctly Canadian. The dreaded bully beef? Same glistening canned regret as the British version, just colder, possibly frozen solid in winter. Canadian troops reportedly used unopened cans as ice bricks. In summer? They just left them unopened for safety reasons. Hardtack, the biscuit equivalent of concrete. Soldiers dunked it in tea, soup, or anything wet enough to prevent emergency dental work. One private claimed he used his as a doorstop after the war. Worked perfectly. Then there was tea, strong, hot, and brewed at every opportunity. Even under shell fire, Canadians could be seen crouched behind sandbags clutching steaming mugs like holy talismans. Tea wasn't a drink, it was national identity with caffeine. Unlike their British counterparts, some Canadians smuggled in homegrown comforts, maple syrup from home, molasses cookies from prairie ants. These treasures were rare and always shared. It's hard to eat while someone watches you with frostbitten eyes. Let's not forget the bacon, issued in salty, fatty blocks, fried over makeshift fires when someone dared risk attracting artillery. Canadians learned bacon is wonderful until rats try stealing it mid-sizzle. The Canadian supply system functioned more efficiently than Britain's. Rations were stretched, swapped, or liberated from nearby units with fewer lookouts. When Britain called, India answered, sending over 1 million troops to fight a war that had nothing to do with them, and even less to offer in familiar food. Indian soldiers, many following strict dietary rules, quickly learned trench rations were about identity lost by spoonful. The standard British ration, beef, hardtack, tea, was inedible to many Indians. Hindus were offered beef. Muslims got pork. Everyone got something violating their beliefs. To their credit, many units refused forbidden meats, instead pooling resources to cook separately when allowed, using helmets as pots and bayonets as utensils. On good days, they replicated simple dishes. On bad days, boiled onions and prayers. Spices, crucial in Indian cooking, were rare unless smuggled in care packages. Without them, every meal tasted like Europe, gray, wet, and vaguely resentful. British commanders, consistently misunderstanding everything, sometimes issued curried bully beef, regular bully beef sprinkled with imperialism and regret. Despite indignities, Indian soldiers improvised. Chapati made with trench flour fried on shovels. Lentils soaked in mess tins. Some carried spice mixtures in cloth bags, guarding them more closely than rifles. Meals were shared communally, the food thin but the dignity thick. This wasn't just about flavor, it was about faith. Getting wrong food wasn't inconvenient, it was spiritually catastrophic. Some refused rations for days. Others bartered with locals to survive without compromise. Indian troops faced not just hunger and cold, but being fundamentally misunderstood by the empire they served. Yet they endured, one steam cloud at a time. African colonial troops serving under French and British command found themselves fighting far from home and even farther from anything resembling familiar cuisine. Hailing from Senegal, Algeria, Morocco, and other corners of empire, these men brought rich culinary traditions straight into Europe's tinned food nightmare. The French at least provided marginally better rations than the British. But for West African troops, cold beef tins and hunks of bread didn't satisfy cravings for millet porridge or spicy peanut stew. The disconnect wasn't just culinary, it was cultural whiplash. Standard issue included hardtack, mystery meat, and occasional salted fish, all violently incompatible with traditional diets both nutritionally and spiritually. Many soldiers improvised field kitchens behind the trenches, fueled by wood fires, helmet pots, and stubborn memory. When rice appeared, they transformed it into something nourishing. A pot of boiling water, handful of grains, and scavenged spices could conjure echoes of home. Dried okra, onions, and peppers, smuggled or bartered, turned dismal French rations into vaguely recognizable meals. Some Algerian and Moroccan units carried small tagines or metal pots, creating slow-cooked stews that made neighboring soldiers simultaneously jealous and confused. Even during bombardments, they kept stirring, seasoning, and serving, because if death was coming, it should at least smell like cumin. But cultural misunderstandings ran deep. Muslim troops frequently received pork rations, religious fasting when ignored. French officers, baffled that their rations weren't universally adored, responded in classic colonial fashion, by blaming the troops for ingratitude. The food struggles mirrored larger injustices. Many African troops were treated as expendable labor, digging trenches, hauling supplies, manning the most dangerous front lines. Meals were rushed, unevenly distributed, or skipped entirely when convenient for command. Yet still they cooked, still they shared, still they adapted. In the face of Europe's culinary homogenization, they resisted with fire, spice, and creativity. Their makeshift kitchens became pockets of cultural resistance where the aromas of home defied the stench of war. Italian soldiers marched toward dreaming of pasta, polenta, and mama's ragu. What they got was beans, military bread, and the frozen realization that nobody cooks al dente under artillery fire. Fighting along mountainous fronts, they endured some of the war's most punishing terrain where food had to be hauled by mule over jagged cliffs, assuming the mules weren't shelled, stolen, or too depressed to continue. The standard ration? Pain de guerre, war bread, a dense gray loaf of wheat, barley, and existential despair. Sturdy enough to stop shrapnel, dry enough to desiccate memories. This was paired with beans boiled into submission and flavored with disappointment and melted snow. Occasional salt pork made appearances, adding fat and salt but little dignity. The meat was tough and stringy, often hacked from frozen slabs with trench knives or creative profanity. When supply lines held, a big if, soldiers might get macaroni or polenta, though both arrived cold, congealed, and far from poetic. Cooking in mountain trenches bordered on impossible, especially when your stove was a rusty shell casing and your fuel was half a fence post. Then there was vino, the modest Italian wine ration that tried lifting spirits but mostly raised eyebrows. Thin and sour, it bore little resemblance to Chianti elegance. Still, a warm sip of red wine in snow-covered trenches reminded men that life once involved tables and chairs. Logistics were a constant enemy. Winter froze food before it reached the front. Summer spoiled it in transit. Between seasons, rats, officers, or your own stomach claimed rations before you opened the tin. Yet Italian soldiers kept eating, singing, and occasionally seasoning. If they couldn't get home to Mama's kitchen, they'd settle for making trench arrosto with extra mud. While the Western Front drowned in mud and mustard gas, the Balkan Front offered mud, mountains, and endless cabbage. Fighting here was brutal, chaotic, and perpetually cold, with cuisine to match. Balkan troops, whether Serbian, Bulgarian, or Montenegrin, survived on whatever could be boiled into submission without violating physics. Cabbage, potatoes, and onions dominated, affordable and sturdy enough to survive transport. Unfortunately, so did their smell, which clung to uniforms, tents, and probably enemy nostrils downwind. Nearly every meal began as soup, thin, greasy, and cooked over campfires, if lucky, or burning furniture, if not. A good soup might contain beans, barley, or mystery legumes. A great soup might include actual meat, usually mutton, pork fat, or former cavalry horses who'd served honorably before becoming delicious. Bread appeared when available, often scarce. Soldiers sometimes fashioned biscuits from flour and water, drying them into stone-like slabs usable as both food and blunt instruments. Coffee was rare, typically replaced with roasted barley or acorns, a pattern seen across poorer fronts. The resulting brew looked like mud, smelled like firewood, and functioned mainly as warm liquid placebo. Balkan soldiers, many former peasants, excelled at making do. A scrap of smoked meat, wild herbs, or garlic clove could elevate boiled despair into something almost nourishing. Almost. Supply lines in the Balkans relied on imagination. Primitive roads and non-existent railroads meant food traveled by ox cart or wishful thinking. Rations arrived late, incomplete, or not at all. Foraging became essential. Stealing from abandoned villages was common. Trading cigarettes for eggs approached Olympic sport. Yet morale somehow persisted, because nothing bonds men like suffering over the same pot of overcooked cabbage. If trench rations were bad, prisoner of war meals made them look gourmet. Captured soldiers found themselves in camps where the only thing worse than company was the cooking. If you could call boiling despair in a pot cooking. The standard POW meal across German, Russian, French, and British camps was soup. Always soup. Thin, gray, occasionally warm. Often described by survivors as watery cabbage or hot liquid with floaters. Nobody asked what floated. Nobody wanted to know. This was paired with bread, stale, dense, and often stretched with sawdust or potato starch. Meat was mythical. When it appeared, it was measured in milligrams. A sliver of ancient sausage, a bone with flavor memories. One French POW camp famously served beef that turned out to be boiled rat. Reviews were mixed. The rat declined to comment. Calories hovered at starvation levels. Many prisoners lost significant weight within weeks. Some adapted, others didn't. In Russian camps where supply chains were theoretical, starvation was common. In German camps, rations dwindled as resources vanished. Then came Red Cross parcels, literal lifelines. These care packages, mostly from Britain, contained tinned meat, biscuits, chocolate, tea, and soap. When they arrived, prisoners guarded them like dragons hoarding gold. Some became camp chefs, creating elaborate meals from parcel contents, sardine pâté, biscuit pudding, even mock roasts. All prepared on makeshift stoves in dirt floor huts under guards with zero culinary appreciation. Food became currency. A jam tin bought socks. Chocolate purchased protection. Real bread slices became political leverage. Behind every emaciated soldier gnawing mystery meat stood forgotten figures with ladles and thousand-yard stares, the trench cooks. These weren't celebrity chefs. They had dented pots, unstable fires, and the daily challenge of turning military rations into something that wouldn't be used as trench mortar. Field kitchens were mobile contraptions dragged behind lines, disguised as soup makers, but actually smoke-belching tanks of stew and ambition. Cooks worked miracles with shortages. They stretched handfuls of beans across pots meant for 30. They rehydrated hardtack into something resembling bread. They made turnips, cabbage, and salted meat vaguely edible through sheer willpower. If culinary miracles existed, they happened behind a cook swearing at his ladle. Food had to be delivered under fire across mud, barbed wire, and rat territories. Soldiers risked lives for hot meals. Cooks risked theirs delivering them. Some armies developed makeshift fire trenches where food could be heated without smoke attracting snipers. In winter, these spots became sacred. In summer, they bred flies. Cook doctors doubled as therapists. Soldiers complained to them, begged for extra bread, joked through clenched teeth. A good cook sustained morale. A bad cook? They didn't last long. One British unit nearly mutinied over burnt porridge. After thousands of miles marched, millions of bullets fired, and more cabbage than any war demanded, one truth remained constant across every front. Eating kept you human. Barely. Trench food wasn't about pleasure or nutrition, just calories. Dense, greasy, bland calories to fuel marching, shooting, digging, and occasional sobbing into your tin bowl. Soldiers learned to eat while crouched, standing, running, or lying in 6 inches of frozen mud. If it was hot, good. If it was solid, better. If it didn't move on its own, a great day. Yet food became something more. In hellish conditions, it was ritual, brewing tea, sharing biscuits, fighting over the least soggy bread crust. It was comfort, not because it tasted good, but because eating meant you'd survived another day. A hot meal lifted spirits faster than speeches. A jam tin could forge friendships. A missing ration could start fistfights. Food was currency, therapy, diplomacy, sometimes the only thing between sanity and the abyss. Each army had its quirks: British tea, French wine, German black bread, Russian kasha, American beans, Ottoman lentils. But the shared experience was universal: misery with a spoon. Let's not forget the improvisation. From helmet-lid stews to mud-brewed coffee, soldiers across continents invented ways to make meals suck slightly less. Field kitchens stretched rations with exhausted creativity. Soldiers learned to cook with anything that didn't explode. Even in captivity or starvation, food meant something: culture, home, identity. The last flicker of who you were before war shoved you into a hole and handed you a spoon. Because in a world collapsing, a hot meal, even one of fat, fear, and cabbage, was a defiant reminder you hadn't given up yet. Long before scalpels, anesthesia, or germ theory, there was trepanation, humanity's boldest and most insane surgical experiment: drilling holes into skulls. What sounds like medieval torture actually predates civilization itself. Archaeologists have uncovered trepan skulls dating back over 7,000 years, scattered from Peru's highlands to Ukraine's plains. Apparently, cracking heads open was humanity's first attempt at brain surgery. But here's the kicker: some patients survived. Not just one or two, many. Healed bone around the holes shows these weren't botched executions, but actual medical procedures. Which forces an uncomfortable truth. Someone, somewhere, looked at seizures, headaches, or mental breakdowns and thought, what if we just let the evil spirits out through the skull? Early medicine wasn't about bacteria or tumors. It was about spirits, curses, and imbalance. Trepanation wasn't risky. It was therapeutic. Headache? Drill. Mood swings? Drill. Battle injury? Drill. Failed marriage? Okay, probably not that one, but you get the idea. The tools? Flint scrapers, obsidian knives, later bronze instruments, all used to carve perfect circles into living bone. Patients were likely awake, held down by helpful or terrified relatives. No anesthesia, just willpower, adrenaline, and maybe some fermented berry juice if they were lucky. What's astonishing is the precision. Some skulls show clean, symmetrical holes. Better work than some first-year med students could manage today. These ancient surgeons lacked modern knowledge, but developed techniques passed down through generations. Their understanding of the brain was as sophisticated as astrology, but their hands? Steady as hell. If one civilization treated surgery with both science and superstition, it was Egypt. These linen-wrapped embalmers didn't just preserve the dead, they patched up the living. Thanks to the Edwin Smith Papyrus, a 3,600-year-old surgical manual that reads like a battlefield medic's diary, we know Egyptians had procedures for fractures, dislocations, abscesses, even spinal injuries. It's basically ancient WebMD, minus the part where every symptom leads to death. Egyptian surgeons worked under the gaze of Imhotep, the architect turned physician turned deity. Before operating, they'd mutter prayers, consult stars, then grab their obsidian scalpels. Surgery wasn't just physical, it was spiritual warfare against disease and demons. Their tools? Surprisingly sophisticated: bronze scalpels, forceps, hooks, bone saws, cauterizing irons. Sure, sterilization meant waving incense over them, but they stitched wounds, drained abscesses, even treated fractures with reed splints and resin-soaked linen. And for infection? Meet the MVP of Egypt's medicine cabinet: honey. Antibacterial, sticky, and shockingly effective, it was slathered on wounds to prevent infection. A trick modern science confirms works. Imagine surviving a crocodile bite because your doctor packed it with the same stuff you drizzle on toast. But Egyptians had limits. They avoided belly and brain surgeries. Organs were divine and off-limits. Got a stomach ulcer or tumor? Better start praying. Unless your condition responded to chants, pus, or strategically placed amulets. Still, Egypt gave us one of the first medical systems separating treatment from guesswork. Even if diagnoses sometimes included curses, their surgical approach was detailed, organized, and, for a society that mummified cats, shockingly advanced. India, meanwhile, produced Sushruta, a physician so skilled he's called the father of surgery. Not an honorary title, the man literally wrote the book on it. The Sushruta Samhita, compiled around 600 BCE, describes 300-plus surgical procedures, 120 instruments, and techniques that'd make medieval barber surgeons faint. Sushruta wasn't some back-alley butcher. He performed cataract removals, hernia repairs, amputations, even rhinoplasty. Lose your nose in battle or punishment. He'd reconstruct it using skin from your cheek or forehead. No anesthesia, just herbal wine to take the edge off, and a very stiff upper lip. Surgery in ancient India was tied to Ayurveda, a holistic system balancing body, mind, and spirit. While surgery was a last resort after herbs, massages, and the occasional cow urine therapy, it was practiced with startling precision. Wounds were cleaned with alcohol, sutured with plant fibers, dressed with antiseptic herbs. Unlike Europe centuries later, Indian surgeons knew cleanliness mattered. Training was brutal. Students practiced incisions on vegetables, leather, dead animals, even water-filled bladders to simulate human tissue. Ayurvedic texts also emphasized ethics, informed consent, treating the poor free. This wasn't just curing illness, it was moral duty. In a world where medicine often leaned mystical, Indian surgery stood out for its empirical, structured approach. The Greeks, meanwhile, gave us Hippocrates, the so-called father of medicine who separated disease from divine punishment. Revolutionary, until you realize most surgery still involved screaming patients and bloodletting. Hippocrates himself wasn't big on complex operations, but knew his way around dislocations, fractures, and abscess drainage. Then came Galen in the 2nd century CE, a Greek physician in Rome obsessed with anatomy. Since human dissection was taboo, he dissected monkeys and pigs instead, creating detailed, and often wildly wrong, theories. Greek surgical tools? Surprisingly advanced. Forceps, catheters, bone saws, hooks. They even cauterized wounds, burning them shut with hot metal. Painful? Absolutely. Effective? Surprisingly, yes. Think of it as ancient laser surgery, except the laser is a red-hot iron bar. Battlefields were the real classrooms. Greek physicians treated arrow wounds, crushed limbs, head injuries, all in real time with zero margin for error. Survive a spear to the gut, and if your surgeon didn't faint at the sight of intestines, you might live. But Greek surgery was still anchored in the four humors, the charmingly unscientific idea that health depended on balancing blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. So even if the operation didn't kill you, an overzealous leech treatment just might. The Romans? They didn't do subtlety, and their surgery was no exception. While Greeks philosophized, Romans built field hospitals and trauma care. When your empire spans continents and your hobby is stabbing people in arenas, you get good at putting bodies back together fast. Enter the medicus, Rome's battlefield surgeon. Stationed with legions, they operated from mobile hospitals called valetudinaria. These weren't places of comfort, but tents of torment, reeking of iron, sweat, and desperation. Roman surgeons excelled at trauma, arrow extraction, broken bone repair, cauterization, amputation. Lose an arm? The medicus had a saw, boiling water, and hope your heart could take it. Anesthesia? Maybe wine or opium if lucky. Otherwise, you got held down. They weren't improvising. Roman medical texts like Celsus's detailed precise procedures, from eye surgeries to hemorrhoid removal, described with unsettling glee. Make an incision long enough for a finger to enter. Their instruments? Nearly modern. Forceps, scalpels, retractors, even adjustable screws. Because if Romans loved anything more than conquering Gaul, it was engineering. They understood infection risk, washing wounds with vinegar, practiced something like triage, and avoided internal surgeries. Gut wounds were usually good luck. But for external trauma, Roman surgeons saved lives at an unprecedented scale. Ancient China took a different approach, balancing yin and yang, body and spirit. Surgery was last resort, preferring acupuncture or herbs. But when needed, Chinese surgeons operated with startling sophistication. Records from the Zhou dynasty, circa 1000 BCE, mention wound treatments and even organ removal. By the Han dynasty, legendary physician Hua Tuo performed abdominal surgeries, tumor removals, and used anesthesia, mephisin, a mix of wine and herbs like datura. Basically, ancient knockout juice. His most famous procedure? Cutting open a warlord's abdomen to remove diseased tissue, then stitching him up successfully. Of course, being ahead of his time got Hua Tuo executed by a paranoid emperor suspecting sorcery. Chinese tools included bronze knives, needles, cauterization irons, many mirroring modern instruments. But philosophy often discouraged invasive treatment. Illness stemmed from energy, qi, blockages in meridians, not rogue organs. So surgery came after herbs, massage, cupping. Still, texts like the Huangdi Neijing show impressive anatomical knowledge. They might not have dissected like Greeks or stitched legions like Romans, but when they operated, it was with purpose, precision, and surprising finesse. The Maya, Aztec, and Inca, their surgery mixed ritual, warfare, and raw necessity. Best known for pyramids and sacrifice, their medical knowledge, especially trepanation and bone repair, was shockingly advanced. Their secret weapon? Obsidian blades, razor-sharp, sterile when fresh, capable of cuts cleaner than modern steel. Some surgeons today still experiment with obsidian because it slices tissue so cleanly. Downside: it shatters, not ideal for OSHA compliance. The Inca were trepanation masters. Evidence shows hundreds of procedures, likely treating head trauma from sling stones or clubs. Astonishingly, some patients survived multiple trepans, with better recovery rates than 19th century Europe, which says a lot about 19th century Europe. Aztecs used herbal anesthetics like toloatzin, a datura relative, to dull pain. Wounds were cleaned with urine or chili pepper tinctures, both antiseptic and unforgettable. Amputations happened for infection, frostbite, or punishment. Medical knowledge was guarded by tactile healers, trained from youth. They treated abscesses, stitched wounds with maguey fibers, set fractures with wooden splints. They knew infection killed and took steps to prevent it, but the line between medicine and ritual was thin. Sometimes cutting flesh wasn't to heal, but to appease gods or read omens. If ancient surgery was a mix of precision and guesswork, medieval Europe took that balance and threw it out a cathedral window. Welcome to the era of barber surgeons, where your haircut and amputation came from the same guy holding the same razor. The Middle Ages weren't all leeches and prayer, but let's be honest, mostly they were. Surgery became the red-headed stepchild of medicine, practiced by barbers because physicians considered manual labor beneath them. Why? Because touching blood and pus was dirty work, best left to the lower class. So while university-trained doctors debated Aristotle and humors, barber surgeons actually did things. They stitched wounds, pulled teeth, set bones, and yes, occasionally bled patients to balance the humors. Their tools? Razors, saws, cautery irons, and a disturbing lack of sterilization. Battlefields remained the great surgical classrooms. Crusaders returned with arrow wounds, infected gashes, and exotic diseases. Barber surgeons learned fast. If you didn't amputate a gangrenous limb quickly, the patient died. If you did it too quickly, they bled out. Solution? A hot iron to cauterize the stump. Screaming was expected. Anesthesia? If you were lucky, you got dwale, a medieval cocktail of hemlock, opium, and bile that might knock you out or just make death seem pleasant. Most patients bit down on leather straps while the barber sawed. Hospitals existed, but hospital meant hostel for the sick, not place of healing. Monks provided basic care, clean bedding, broth, prayer, but actual surgery? That happened in your home, the barber shop, or right on the battlefield. Then came the Black Death, 1347 to 1351, which made everything worse. Physicians fled cities. Barbers died alongside patients. Surgery? Suddenly nobody wanted a stranger's hands inside them, when the air itself seemed poisonous. The plague didn't just kill millions, it stalled medical progress for generations. But not everywhere. While Europe floundered, the Islamic world was having its golden age of medicine. Arabic physicians didn't just preserve Greek and Roman knowledge, they expanded it. Take Al-Zarawi, 936 to 1013, the father of modern surgery. His 30-volume Al-Tasrif detailed hundreds of instruments and techniques, many still used today. Bone saws? Check. Forceps? Check. Surgical needles? Yep. He even invented catgut sutures, using sheep intestines to stitch wounds, a technique that lasted centuries. Arabic hospitals, by Maristans, were light years ahead. They had separate wards, trained nurses, even medical schools. Surgeons apprenticed under masters, learning anatomy through observation, not just theory. Anesthesia improved too. Islamic physicians used spongia somnifera, a sponge soaked in opium, cannabis, and mandrake juice, to sedate patients before surgery. Not perfect, but better than biting a stick. They also pioneered antisepsis, cleaning wounds with wine or vinegar, and cauterization for bleeding. Amputations were last resort, unlike Europe's soft first, ask later approach. Most revolutionary? Their understanding of anatomy. While Christian Europe banned human dissection, the body was sacred. Islamic scholars studied it openly. They mapped organs, described circulation, even challenged Galen's errors. This wasn't just medicine, it was science. Systematic, evidence-based, and shockingly modern. Meanwhile, back in Europe, surgery remained a trade, not a science. Barber surgeons formed guilds, passing knowledge orally. No standardized training, no real oversight. Just a guy with sharp tools and hopefully steady hands. Then came Guy de Chauliac, 1300 to 1368, the closest medieval Europe got to a celebrity surgeon. His Chirurgia Magna became the surgical textbook for centuries. He advocated for clean incisions, proper wound drainage, and, when possible, not letting patients bleed to death. But even Chauliac believed pus was good, laudable pus, he called it. Why? Because if a wound oozed yellow gunk, it meant the body was expelling bad humors. This misunderstanding of infection would haunt surgery for 500 more years. The Renaissance, 14th to 17th centuries, should have fixed everything. Humanism, science, art. Instead, surgery got weirder. Anatomy finally got its due thanks to Andreas Vesalius, 1514 to 1564, who stole corpses to dissect them. His De Humani Corporis Fabrica was the first accurate anatomy book, proving Galen wrong on everything. Surgeons now had proper maps of the body, if they bothered to read. But knowledge didn't equal safety. Surgery was still brutal. Without anesthesia or antisepsis, operations were short, bloody, and agonizing. Speed mattered more than precision. Amputations took seconds. A good surgeon could lop off a leg before the patient passed out from pain. The record? 28 seconds, set by Scottish surgeon Robert Liston, who once accidentally sliced off a patient's testicle along with the leg. The patient died anyway from infection. Battlefield surgery remained a nightmare. Gunpowder weapons created new injuries, shattered bones, embedded shrapnel, burns. Standard treatment? Probe the wound with unwashed fingers, then either amputate or pray. The barber-surgeon hierarchy slowly faded as universities began teaching surgery. But old habits died hard. Even in the 1700s, many surgeons had no formal training. Then came John Hunter, 1728 to 1793, the mad genius of surgery. He dissected thousands of bodies, mapped lymphatic systems, and proved blood vessels healed after ligation, tying them off, meaning amputation didn't always require cauterization. Hunter also experimented, injecting himself with gonorrhea to study it, bad idea, and pioneering ligature techniques to save limbs. His motto? Don't think, try. But for every Hunter, there were hundreds of hacks. Surgery remained a gamble. Hospitals were death traps, overcrowded, filthy, and ripe with hospital fever, typhus. Patients often died from infection rather than the original injury. The 19th century finally brought real change. First, anesthesia, 1846, no more screaming patients. Then antisepsis, 1860s, thanks to Joseph Lister and carbolic acid. Suddenly, surgery wasn't just possible, it was survivable. But old beliefs lingered. Many surgeons hated Lister's germ theory. Washing hands. Insulting. Sterilizing tools. Too much work. Change came slowly, often forced by statistics. Hospitals using antisepsis had fewer deaths. By 1900, surgery had transformed from butchery to science. Specialties emerged: neurosurgery, orthopedics, cardiology. The 20th century added antibiotics, blood transfusions, and minimally invasive techniques. Yet traces of the past remain. The scalpel symbol still decorates barber poles. The word surgeon comes from Greek chair, hand, and ergon, work, because surgery was always about doing, not just theorizing. And trepanation? It's back, sort of. Modern craniotomies save lives by relieving brain pressure. The tools are better, the reasons clearer, but the principle? Still cutting holes in skulls. Some things never change. If medieval surgery was a horror show, the Industrial Revolution turned it into something far worse, a mechanized horror show. The 19th century didn't just bring steam engines and factories. It brought surgical theaters where operations became public spectacles, speed trials where surgeons competed to amputate limbs in under a minute, and medical experiments that would make even the most hardened Victorian flinch. Let's start with the operating theater, a grand, gory stage where surgeons performed in front of rows of medical students, curious onlookers, and the occasional fainting spectator. These weren't sterile environments. They were bloodsport arenas. The air reeked of pus, sweat, and the unmistakable metallic tang of fresh blood. Patients were strapped down, fully conscious, while surgeons worked fast, not just to minimize pain, but to entertain. The star of the show? Robert Liston, the fastest knife in London. Known as the fastest surgeon in the West End, Liston could remove a leg in 28 seconds flat. His secret? A brutal disregard for subtlety. He'd grip the limb with one hand, slice through flesh with the other, then saw through bone before the patient's scream had even reached its peak. One legendary operation saw Liston amputate a leg so quickly that he also accidentally sliced off his assistant's fingers. Both the patient and the assistant later died of infection. A spectator reportedly dropped dead from shock. The only survivor? The knife, which Liston kept using. This wasn't medicine. This was performance art with a body count. But speed wasn't the only problem. Infection was the real killer. Hospitals in the 1800s were death traps, filthy, overcrowded, and reeking of gangrene. Surgeons wore blood-stained aprons like badges of honor, moving from one patient to the next without washing their hands. The result? Surgical fevers, infections that turned minor wounds into death sentences. Then came Ignaz Semmelweis, a Hungarian doctor who noticed something horrifying. Women giving birth in hospitals were dying at alarming rates from childbed fever. The cause? Doctors were performing autopsies and then delivering babies, without washing their hands. Semmelweis ordered his staff to wash with chlorine solution before deliveries. The result? Death rates plummeted. You'd think this would be celebrated. Instead, Semmelweis was ridiculed. Established surgeons refused to believe their filthy hands were killing patients. Semmelweis was fired, mocked, and eventually committed to an asylum, where he died of an infected wound. The irony was thick enough to choke on. Meanwhile, anesthesia was finally making surgery less torturous. In 1846, dentist William Morton demonstrated ether as an anesthetic during a public surgery in Boston. The patient felt nothing. The audience was stunned. Within years, ether and chloroform became standard, though not without controversy. Some religious groups argued pain was God's will. To remove it was heresy. Others feared anesthesia would stop the heart. Spoiler, it sometimes did. But for patients, the choice was clear. Unconsciousness beat screaming through an amputation. Yet anesthesia didn't solve infection. That breakthrough came from Joseph Lister, a British surgeon who applied Louis Pasteur's germ theory to medicine. Lister realized that invisible microbes caused infections, and that carbolic acid could kill them. His method? Spraying instruments, wounds, and even the operating room air with carbolic acid. The result? Dramatically fewer deaths. But old habits died hard. Many surgeons hated Lister's ideas. Cleaning tools? Too much work. Sterilizing bandages? Unnecessary. Some even boasted about their blood-crusted coats as proof of experience. Lister fought for decades to convince them. Slowly, painfully, antisepsis became standard. By the 1880s, surgery was finally becoming safe, or at least less lethal. But the 19th century wasn't done with medical horrors. Enter vivisection, the practice of operating on live animals for research. Dogs, rabbits, even horses were strapped down and dissected without anesthesia in the name of science. The public revolted. Anti-vivisection movements sprang up, leading to laws requiring anesthesia for animal experiments. But the damage was done. Vivisection became a dark stain on medical progress. Then came World War I, the ultimate test for modern surgery. Battlefields became experimental labs for trauma medicine. Shell fragments, machine gun wounds, and chemical burns forced surgeons to innovate fast. Blood transfusions went from rare to routine. X-rays, discovered in 1895, helped locate bullets and shrapnel. Plastic surgery was born out of necessity. Doctors reconstructed faces shattered by shrapnel. But the war also exposed how little medicine still understood. Trench foot, shell shock, and gas injuries baffled doctors. Soldiers survived surgery only to die from infection in filthy field hospitals. By 1918, surgery had come far, but the human body remained a frontier. The 20th century would change that. Antibiotics, penicillin, discovered in 1928, made infections treatable. Blood typing made transfusions safe. Microsurgery allowed reattachment of limbs. Yet the ghosts of the past lingered. The Tuskegee syphilis experiment, 1932 to 1972, saw U.S. doctors withhold treatment from black men to study the disease's progression. A horrific echo of Semmelweis's ignored warnings. Surgery had become scientific, but ethics still lagged behind. Today, we have robot-assisted surgery, laser precision, and 3D printed organs. Yet every time a surgeon scrubs in, they're standing on centuries of trial and terror, of screaming patients, filthy knives, and Liston's blood-soaked 28-second amputations. Progress wasn't clean. It was messy, painful, and often deadly. But it got us here. If the 19th century was surgery's reckless adolescence, the 20th century became its sobering adulthood, complete with world wars, ethical dilemmas, and the sudden realization that maybe we shouldn't treat human bodies like malfunctioning machines. The First World War had already forced medicine to evolve at gunpoint, but World War II turned hospitals into full-blown trauma laboratories. Battlefield surgeons now faced new nightmares: flamethrower burns, tank-crushed limbs, and radiation sickness from atomic blasts. American medic Charles Drew revolutionized blood banking, proving plasma could be stored and shipped to front lines. This wasn't just science, it was logistics warfare. Suddenly, blood transfusions weren't rare miracles, but standard procedure. But war medicine had dark corners. Nazi Joseph Mengele conducted grotesque experiments on prisoners, freezing limbs, injecting dyes into eyes, amputating without anesthesia. These weren't medical advances. They were atrocities disguised as research. When Allied troops liberated camps, they found notebooks filled with data, all scientifically rigorous, all utterly monstrous. This forced a reckoning. Where's the line between progress and evil? The Nuremberg Code, 1947, established ethical guidelines: voluntary consent, benefit outweighing risk, no unnecessary suffering. Simple principles, ones Mengele had gleefully ignored. Meanwhile, penicillin, discovered by accident in 1928, became mass-produced during World War II. A moldy petri dish now saved more lives than all the medieval barber surgeons combined. Infections that once meant death became treatable. Surgeons could finally cut without dooming patients to sepsis. The Cold War then weaponized medicine. Both sides raced to master organ transplants, artificial hearts, even space surgery. Because if astronauts needed appendectomies in zero gravity, someone had to figure it out. In 1954, Joseph Murray performed the first successful kidney transplant between identical twins. No immunosuppressants needed. Their matching DNA prevented rejection. This breakthrough opened the transplant era, though early patients died from organ rejection or brutal anti-rejection drugs. Then came Christiaan Barnard's 1967 heart transplant, a media circus where the patient lived just 18 days. The heart kept beating, the body didn't. Yet Barnard proved it was possible, if not yet perfected. The 1970s brought keyhole surgery, tiny incisions, cameras, and precision tools replacing meat cleaver approaches. Recovery times shrank from weeks to days. Patients went from surviving surgery to walking out of it. But progress wasn't linear. The artificial heart, 1982, kept patients alive, tethered to washing machine-sized pumps. The first recipient, Barney Clark, survived 112 days in agony, begging to die. The lesson? Technology alone isn't healing. Then came laparoscopy, surgery through pencil-sized holes. Gallbladders vanished through slits. Hernias were patched without cracking ribs. This was medicine's minimalist phase. Less cutting, less scarring, fewer complications. The 21st century went further. Robotic arms steadier than human hands. 3D, printed organs, gene-edited cells. Yet for all our tech, surgery still depends on fallible humans, now armed with lasers instead of saws. We've come far from trepanation, but the core challenge remains: how to fix bodies without breaking souls in the process. If modern surgery has become a high-tech ballet of robotics and micro-incisions, then neurosurgery is its most death-defying tightrope act, where one tremor could erase memories, paralyze limbs, or worse. The brain wasn't always considered operable territory. Ancient Egyptians discarded it during mummification via nasal hooks. Aristotle thought it just cooled the blood, and medieval scholars debated whether it housed the soul or just phlegm. Then came trepanation, our earliest brain surgery. Some patients survived, proving the brain could heal after invasion. But for centuries, that's where brain science stalled. Cutting into the seat of consciousness seemed like poking God's private library. The 19th century changed that. Paul Broca, 1824 to 1880, autopsied a patient who'd lost speech but not comprehension, finding damage in the left frontal lobe. The Broca's area was born, proof that specific brain regions controlled specific functions. Suddenly, the brain was a map waiting to be charted. Enter Harvey Cushing, 1869 to 1939, the father of modern neurosurgery. In an era when most brain tumor patients died, Cushing developed techniques to remove tumors while preserving function. His secret? Patience. Where others rushed, he moved millimeter by millimeter, developing tools like the Cushing forceps still used today. But even Cushing's brilliance couldn't overcome infection. Without antibiotics, post-op meningitis killed more patients than the tumors themselves. The mid-20th century brought two game changers: steroids to reduce brain swelling and the operating microscope. Suddenly, surgeons could see nerve fibers and blood vessels in vivid detail. Then came Wilder Penfield, 1891 to 1976, who mapped the brain live, using electrodes on awake epilepsy patients. "What do you feel?" he'd ask as currents sparked hallucinations, memories, or phantom smells. His cortical homunculus, a grotesque body-shaped map of the brain, showed how much space the brain devotes to lips and fingers versus, say, your back. The 1970s introduced CT scans and MRIs, letting surgeons see tumors before cutting. No more exploratory craniotomies. Now they could plan. But the real revolution? Functional MRI, 1990s, which showed active brain areas in real time. Surgeons could now avoid speech or movement zones during tumor removal. Some even performed awake craniotomies, having patients recite poems or wiggle fingers while their exposed brains were probed. Today's neurosurgeons wield ultrasound aspirators, tumor zapping sound waves, gamma knives, precise radiation beams, and neural implants that bypass spinal cord damage. Yet for all our tech, the brain remains the ultimate frontier. 3 pounds of mystery we're still decoding. If neurosurgery represents medicine's most delicate frontier, then transplant surgery is its most defiant act of rebellion, a declaration that death doesn't get the final say. But this revolution didn't come easy. It was built on corpses, failed experiments, and a stubborn refusal to accept biological limits. The first documented transplant attempt was in 16th century Italy, a poor man's nose reconstructed using someone else's arm skin. It rotted off within weeks. For centuries afterward, transplants remained the stuff of myth, saints grafting limbs, and macabre fiction, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. The real breakthrough came in 1902. French surgeon Alexis Carrel developed vascular suturing techniques to reconnect blood vessels. Suddenly, organs could theoretically be transferred instead of just stitched in place. His experiments on dogs proved organs could survive transplantation briefly. The problem? Rejection. The immune system treats foreign tissue like an invading army. Without a way to suppress this response, transplanted organs were doomed. Then came World War II, where burns and trauma forced surgeons to experiment with skin grafts. They discovered that identical twins could exchange skin without rejection, a clue that genetic matching mattered. In 1954, this led to the first successful kidney transplant between identical twins, performed by Joseph Murray in Boston. No anti-rejection drugs needed. The recipient lived 8 years with his brother's kidney. But what about non-twins? The answer came from azathioprine, an immunosuppressant derived from chemical weapons research. By the 1960s, it allowed kidney transplants between unrelated donors, though patients often died from opportunistic infections or drug toxicity. The liver and heart were next. In 1963, Thomas Starzl performed the first liver transplant. The patient bled to death on the table. His second attempt lasted 22 days before rejection. It wasn't until 1967 that cyclosporin, a fungus-derived immunosuppressant, made liver transplants viable. Hearts were even trickier. When Christiaan Barnard transplanted the first human heart in 1967, the patient lived just 18 days. The surgery was possible, but keeping the heart alive long-term? That required better drugs. The 1980s brought FK506, tacrolimus, a 100x more potent immunosuppressant isolated from soil bacteria. Suddenly, transplant survival rates soared. Livers, lungs, even multi-organ transplants became routine. But this created new nightmares. Patients trading organ failure for lifelong drug side effects, diabetes, cancer, kidney damage. A black market for organs where the poor sold kidneys to the rich. The ethical quagmire of brain death. When is a donor truly dead? Today, transplants push further. Face transplants, 2005 onward. Reconstructing identities along with tissue. Uterus transplants, 2014, allowing infertile women to carry pregnancies. Xenotransplants, 2022, using gene-edited pig hearts for humans. Yet the dream remains elusive, to transplant without lifelong immunosuppression. Maybe stem cell-grown organs or 3D printed tissues will get us there. For now, every transplant is still a calculated rebellion against time, biology, and mortality itself. If transplant surgery is medicine's defiance of death, then prosthetics are its stubborn refusal to accept defeat. A 3,000-year-old testament to human ingenuity in the face of loss. From wooden toes to bionic arms, we've spent millennia rebuilding what war, accident, and disease have taken away. The earliest known prosthetic? A 3,000-year-old wooden toe found on an Egyptian mummy. Carved from tamarisk wood and secured with leather straps. It wasn't just cosmetic, or patterns suggest it helped its owner walk. The Egyptians understood. Losing a limb didn't mean losing function. The Greeks and Romans took this further. The Capua leg, 300 BCE, made of bronze and iron, was the first load-bearing prosthetic. Found in a Roman tomb, its design suggests it was articulated, allowing the wearer to bend the knee. Then there's the legend of Marcus Sergius, a Roman general who lost his right hand in battle and replaced it with an iron fist, which he then used to hold his shield and keep fighting. The Middle Ages brought peg legs and hook hands, crude but effective. Knights who lost limbs in battle often commissioned blacksmiths to forge replacements. These weren't subtle. An iron gauntlet could crush a goblet or a skull with equal ease. But prosthetics didn't truly evolve until gunpowder made battlefield injuries far worse. The 16th century saw ambulatory legs with locking knees and articulated feet. German mercenary Gotz von Berlichingen wore 2 iron hands after losing his right arm to cannon fire. His prosthetic had fingers that could grip a sword, making him one of the first cyborgs in history. The Industrial Revolution turned prosthetics into mass-produced commodities. The Anglesey leg, 1840s, made of cork and steel, became the standard for amputees, including Civil War veterans. It was lightweight, adjustable, and even had a spring-loaded ankle. But the real leap came after World War I, when thousands of young men returned home missing limbs. Governments funded research into functional prosthetics, not just cosmetic ones. The hanger limb, 1915, used catgut tendons to simulate finger movement. The Carnes arm, 1916, had a pulley system for elbow flexion. World War II accelerated this further. The VA system in the US began standardizing prosthetic care. Plastics replaced wood and metal, making limbs lighter. Myoelectric technology, 1940s, used electrical signals from residual muscles to control movement, a precursor to bionics. Today's prosthetics are miracles of engineering. Bionic arms with individual finger control, powered by muscle sensors or brain-computer interfaces. Running blades that let amputees outpace Olympians. 3D, printed limbs costing a fraction of traditional prosthetics. Yet challenges remain. Neural integration, making prosthetics feel like part of the body. Affordability, high-tech limbs remain out of reach for many. Phantom pain, the cruel irony of feeling a limb that's no longer there. Prosthetics have come far from that Egyptian wooden toe, but the goal remains the same, to restore not just function, but identity. Because losing a limb shouldn't mean losing yourself. While scalpels and prosthetics rebuilt bodies, another quiet revolution was unfolding in the shadows. The war against invisible killers that turned surgery from a gamble to a science. This is the story of antisepsis, where the greatest enemy wasn't disease but human stubbornness, and where the heroes carried carbolic acid instead of surgical knives. For centuries, surgeons operated in filth without realizing it. They wore blood-crusted coats like badges of honor, reused unwashed bandages, and took pride in the good old surgical stink of their operating theaters. The results were predictable. 80% of amputee deaths in the 1840s came not from the procedure itself, but from the greenish pus of hospital fever, what we now call septicemia. Enter Ignaz Semmelweis, the Hungarian doctor who noticed in 1847 that women giving birth in physician-run wards died at triple the rate of midwife-assisted births. The difference? Physicians came straight from dissecting corpses to deliveries without washing hands. When Semmelweis ordered chlorine hand washing, mortality rates plummeted from 18% to 2%. The medical establishment's response? Outrage. Senior physicians called him insane for suggesting their hands, gentlemen's hands, could carry death. Semmelweis was fired, driven to mental collapse, and died in an asylum of an infected wound. The irony was thicker than surgical pus. Meanwhile in Glasgow, Joseph Lister read Louis Pasteur's germ theory in 1865 and had an epiphany. If microbes caused fermentation, maybe they also caused surgical infections. His solution? Carbolic acid spray, a pungent coal tar derivative that burns surgeons' lungs but halved amputation mortality rates. Lister faced similar resistance. Surgeons complained the acid irritated their skin. It did. Made operating theaters smell like a tar factory. True, and worst of all, implied their practices were dirty. One London surgeon sneered, "Little Lister and his germs may stay in Scotland." The breakthrough came when German surgeons adopted Lister's methods first. By 1875, when a German prince survived a Lister-treated compound fracture, even Britain's royal surgeons couldn't ignore the evidence. The aseptic surgery era began. Steam sterilization of instruments, 1886. Surgical gloves, 1890, invented for a nurse allergic to carbolic acid. Face masks, 1897. After a surgeon proved talking could infect wounds. But old habits died hard. As late as 1910, prominent American surgeons still resisted gloves, claiming they lost the feel of the tissue. The last holdouts only surrendered when World War I proved antiseptic techniques saved lives in trench hospitals. Today's operating rooms would astonish Victorian surgeons. UV-lit air filtration systems. single-use sterile packs for every instrument, antibiotic-impregnated sutures. Yet the ghosts of pre-antiseptic medicine linger. Superbugs evolved from our overuse of antibiotics. Surgical site infections still cause 17% of post-op deaths globally. In some developing nations, Semmelweis's hand-washing lesson still needs reteaching. The antisepsis revolution wasn't about tools or techniques. It was about unlearning centuries of deadly arrogance. It proved the greatest surgical innovation wasn't how we cut, but how we stopped poisoning our patients accidentally. The true measure of a civilization isn't found in its grandest banquets, but in what men scrape from their mess tins when death licks the plate clean. In the trenches, food became timekeeping. The daily bully beef marking another sunless dawn survived. For surgeons, it was fuel, cold coffee ghoul-ged between amputations, the grease of hardtack blending with blood under fingernails. Both rituals shared a silent creed. You must eat today to kill or cure tomorrow. Archaeologists digging World War I sites still find these paradoxes frozen in mud. A surgical kit wedged inside a biscuit tin, its scalpels polished by the same hands that once portioned marmalade. A German trench oven built from salvaged operating table metal, its crusty loaves baked where limbs once smoked under bone saws. French wine bottles repurposed as for drips, their necks snapped off to funnel saline into veins. The ultimate fusion came in 1917, when a Canadian field hospital near Vimy Ridge served resurrection stew, a broth made from bully beef, fat skimmed to dress burns. Pumpkin salvaged from no man's land, planted by some long-dead farmer. Morphine dregs from emptied ampoules for flavor. Men swore it tasted like redemption. Today, armies issue nutritionally complete rations and portable ICUs, but the calculus remains unchanged. Every calorie a soldier doesn't eat is one a medic might later need to revive. The Geneva Convention now classifies food and medicine as twin pillars of warfare, not because they win battles, but because their absence unmakes humans faster than shells. So let this be the epitaph for all battlefields. Here, some starve, so others might be fed. Here, some ate knowing it was another man's last supper. And here, always, the ladle and the scalpel pass like instruments of communion between the living and the soon-to-be.